Well, lovely. Why don't we get the show started? Neil, would you like to just move us forward to the first slide, and I can give an outline of the presentation and who we've got speaking this morning. A big welcome to everybody this morning. This is Mark DeRoche with Interactive Services. I'm based out of our New York office, despite the British accent. And as a firm, for the past 3 months now, we've been looking at the topic of GDPR. It's something that a lot of our clients have been asking about, and over the course of that time, we've learned a lot of lessons, both from a legal content perspective, but also instructionally about how to teach GDPR. So for the next 20 to 30 minutes, myself and Paddy McGovern, who is joining us from my head office in Dublin, Ireland, will be walking you through our journey in terms of what we've learned about the topic and giving you some insights around how to train for this subject that is certainly getting a lot of attention, both in Europe and for firms that are based throughout the globe. In terms of the session, we will be sharing the presentation afterwards, so there's no need to take frantic notes. We'll be sending that on as part of the kit for anybody that participates. And at any time, you can send in questions. They'll be handled by our colleague Neil, who'll be demoing some GDPR training today. So if you just feed those in, we'll allow the last 5 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. In terms of the outline, as I said there, it'll be about 20 to 30 minutes long. We'll talk about our company's own journey through GDPR. We'll look at the legislation and what it means for us as learning professionals. From there, the real backbone of the session will be an interview with Paddy McGovern, when he'll talk about the process that's involved in designing training for a new piece of legislation, what we did, what we learned, and what the outcomes were. And then finally, we'll take a peek at a GDPR training product, which will be going live with our first client deployments in September. So it's an opportunity for a sneak peek, and we'll talk about what happens next in terms of if you want to have a look at those materials in detail. Great, well, why don't I kick us off? We'll start with our journey in terms of who we are and exploration through GDPR. So for those of you that are new to our firm, Interactive Services, we've been around for 24 years. We're an Irish company headquartered out of Dublin, Ireland, but we very much work with big global brands, typically firms that are in the top 3 for their respective industry. And historically, we have designed custom training, but in the past 2 years, we've invested heavily in building up our corporate compliance learning practice. And you'll see here on the next slide an overview of the product that we've built. So just to cover this off very briefly, today we have 80 topics. They're available in 12 languages. All of our training is designed to be customized. We update it every year in partnership with Cordery Compliance, who are part of the LexisNexis group of companies. It usually sits on our client's LMS, but we can host it on your behalf. Everything that we build is mobile ready, and then typically for most firms we would do enterprise-wide pricing. So you'll see here the topics that we're launching this month, our new GDPR curriculum. Each of those lines represents a 5-minute topic. And what's interesting is you can mix and match those topics to create your own program. So you may want to push somebody in marketing who has specialist GDPR responsibilities through the whole program, whereas your general workforce maybe will take 1 or 2 topics. We also offer Privacy Shield if you're looking at the reciprocal legislation from the US, but again, that can be switched off. And for broader context, you'll see how that is a part of our overall broader library. So certainly the GDPR topics that we've presented here today, you can mix and match those with any of the training that you see in the broader library, such as data privacy or information security. Okay, so that's that piece of the presentation out the way. Let's get into the real meat of it in terms of what does GDPR mean for us as training professionals. I'll try and just go back there a second if you don't mind. I'll try and give us a definition, what the impact is, and then what the training means. So let's get started with that definition. GDPR is, correct me if I'm wrong here, the general data. Gosh, Paddy, you'll have to chime in here. Can you just remind us what GDPR actually stands for?
General Data Protection Regulation.
There we go, fantastic. That one escapes me sometimes. So essentially what the legislation is doing is it's harmonizing data privacy and the protection that is offered to EU citizens for every country that's involved in the EU bloc. When we look at the the key outcomes of it, I mean, I think there's two areas that are critical. The first is it makes privacy at the heart of every business process, right from the start. So every time we think about designing a business process, data privacy needs to come at the start rather than something that is added at the end. The other piece is, if we look at what's happened in the past 3 or 4 years, I mean, the change in how the internet is used, how we interact with it, the services that we rely on, has grown exponentially. You know, from how we order taxis when we go in the morning, how we share information on social media. And as a consequence of that, there's a lot more different types of personally identifiable information that is floating around. So GDPR essentially brings up to date the legislation and makes it in tune with what counts as personally identifiable information, such as IP addresses, cookie identifiers, and even the identification number of mobile devices. While the legislation comes into effect in May of next year, we're finding that most firms are putting in place their training programs this year ahead of the launch. Paddy, is there anything that you would add in terms of those definitions that we've touched on there, or any detail that you would include?
No, I think just to say, Mark, that I suppose the whole driving factor behind the GDPR is to enhance the protection of personal data of EU citizens, and it also applies to any companies outside the EU that handle data belonging to EU citizens. So if you're a US-based company and you track cookie identifiers of EU customers, you are subject to GDPR. You don't even have to have a location in the EU. If you're dealing with any holding or processing personal data of EU citizens, the GDPR applies to you.
You'll see that some of that summarized on the next slide here. So as Paddy mentioned there, the GDPR legislation impacts any firm worldwide regardless of their locale. Essentially, if you are handling the information that could impact citizens of the European Union or even just individuals that are based in the European Union, GDPR applies. And you'll see that the fines are pretty stringent. You can be fined up to 4% of annual global turnover, or 20 million euros for smaller firms, and they go with whichever is greater. And the two big outcomes there: privacy is built into the whole life cycle of the business, as we talked about. And then secondly, any product or service that is released to the public, by default, it must have the maximum privacy settings enabled. So a good example of that would be if you're signing up for a new social media website, the site can only by default ask you for the minimum amount of information, and then by default, that would be what you'd be asked, and then more detailed information about where you live, your date of birth. Those fields that are optional would be required to be set up as things that you can add if you want to. So in essence, the maximum privacy setting is what always happens by default. Let's talk about the training requirement. We are seeing the first deployments of GDPR at the moment. Typically, it's been spearheaded by EU firms that have large global operations. And the key piece of this is Article 39, which states the obligation of a privacy officer to monitor compliance with this regulation, with other union or member state data protection provisions, and with the policies of the controller or processor in relation to the protection of personal data, including the assignment of responsibilities, awareness raising, and training of staff involving processing, operations, and the related audits. Now, I think what really strikes home here is the legislation is pretty vague, and that's in line with what we've seen from other regulators, both in Europe and in the US, where it's very rare for a piece of legislation to state in detail what training is required. So this legislation around awareness raising and training of staff, with no reference around duration, which positions are specifically need to be trained, or topics, that seems to be par for the course. However, having said that, based upon what we've seen for other key pieces of training, We think it's typical to train for up to 30 minutes. Anything longer than that we would see as being superfluous. So for this initial rollout, we would expect training between 15 and 30 minutes, depending upon the role of an organization. You may want to make longer, more specialist pieces of training available to HR, IT, and marketing staff who have specialist provisions. And then perhaps more interestingly is to start thinking about a training cadence. So we would expect to put the whole organization through the training in year one. That may even happen towards the end of 2017. And then in year 2 and year 3, we would expect either a shorter refresher version of the training, or we might want to offer a test down where we give employees an opportunity to demonstrate what they know about GDPR and only take a shorter 5 to 10 minute version of the course if they can pass a quiz and show that they've retained the knowledge from what they learned in the first training cycle. So with that in mind, let's take a moment to have a chat with Paddy McGovern. Paddy has been our head of content strategy for corporate compliance for the past, I think, 2 years now. I know historically that you've worked on, I think it's about 30 or 40 global compliance programs at big institutions, so there's a lot of experience to handle on. Paddy, there's a series of questions that we'd like to run you through that are shown on the slide here, and thanks so much for taking time to have a chat with us this morning. Could you talk us about how you picked the topics for GDPR? I know obviously legislation like this can be very broad. We wanted to keep the learning experience manageable. How did you choose the sequence of topics and get the duration right?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing that we did was we did our research. We researched GDPR from a number of different resources. We also spoke with our legal partner, Cordery Compliance, who are somewhat of an experts in GDPR. So then we analysed all the content and we determined what was needed and what really wasn't needed for a learner. So I suppose at the end of the day, this module is really around, as you said, awareness training of GDPR for general staff, and we can go into a little bit more detail for HR and IT personnel. So ideally, with all of our compliance training, we try to keep, as you said, our topics to maybe 5 or 6 minutes in duration. We identified 3 or 4 key areas that we needed to cover in relation to the GDPR, and that's really what we based our topics around. So you'll see in our topic menu that we have an opening topic which covers what the GDPR is. We have another one then that just gives an illustration of the GDPR in action, really how the law applies to personal data. Then we have a topic on international data transfers, and then we have the other one that you've mentioned that is not necessarily, it isn't GDPR, but it's related in some way, the Privacy Shield, because we thought that would be valuable for any US organizations that might also have an interest in GDPR. So that's really how we set about determining the content that would go into our module. And then from a learning perspective and instructional design methodology, each of the topics follows a similar design methodology in that we cover 3 key elements in each topic. It's really learn it, work it, apply it. So learn it means we give the learner the information they need to know. So for example, what GDPR is, define what it is, how it impacts them, how it impacts the company. Then we present them with, in the work it section, with some real life scenarios that outline how the GDPR might impact them in their day-to-day environment and what is the correct action to take in certain situations. So we give them a chance to practice that with no consequences if they get questions wrong. And then we finish off with our little assessment at the end of each topic.
So I just got dropped by our phone service there, so I don't know whether Neil just stepped in or you kept on speaking while I was off the call for a moment there.
Timed up perfectly, Mark. I've just finished talking when you got to get back in.
Okay, these things happen. We're all, yeah, there we go. If you hear the line go dead, it means our voice over IP phones have dropped us. But we'll keep going. Can you talk about how you built motivation around GDPR? I mean, I know the consequences can be spectacular and it can really hit the front page, but on a day-to-day basis, the topic of data privacy isn't one that always inspires excitement in learners when it comes up.
Well, exactly. I mean, for the key, I suppose, person in the workplace, when you say the company could be fined up to 20 million, for a lot of people that doesn't really impact them. So the key thing to do with this GDPR training is make it relatable to the learner and their everyday role. So we have a little video that opens our training that I think Neil is going to demo shortly, and that really gives a good picture of how the GDPR is relevant to each individual, both from how it benefits them if you're an EU citizen, and then how it impacts on their work within the company. And then we try and relate that back to the GDPR, back to their work situation, and what impact the GDPR has on what they do on a day-to-day basis, to try and engage them in our training and also motivate them to understand what the GDPR is, take it on board, understand that it does impact their day-to-day work, even though when they first hear GDPR, they might think that it doesn't.
And can you talk about the scenarios, just to build on making those relevant, and how the scenarios interact with the test strategy? Yeah,
so what we do with our scenarios is, scenarios really allow us to engage the learner, but also make the content relevant to the learner. So we try and set the scenarios in real-life, everyday situations. And seeing as this is a global compliance program, the scenarios are as generic as possible, so they relate to most learners. So they're all around how you handle data, how you transfer data, etc. So we might have little scenarios around you wanting to send a marketing strategy to a colleague in the US, but it contains the personal data of some EU customers that you have. What protections do you need to have in place before you can send that strategy? So we try and relate it back to what people will do on an everyday basis, because that's the best way of engaging them with the training. If you can make it relevant to them straight off the bat, they will engage with the training, buy into what you're doing, and pay attention to what we have covered in the training.
Love it. And then what about the tests? How do they fit alongside the scenarios?
Yeah, so the test strategy we have at the end of each topic, we have a little 5-question assessment. The tests on the content that's been presented in the topic. Currently, in our standard module, it's set to an 80% pass mark. Obviously, that is configurable based on client requirements. The test questions themselves are binary questions, so they're yes, no, true, false. So they really give us the opportunity to enforce the content that we have introduced in the topic, and also allow clients then to track the completion rates of their staff so that they can show the regulators, well, we've had 80% of staff take this training and we've had 75% of them pass each of the topics, etc. So it serves two purposes. It allows us to test that the learners have taken on board the knowledge in each topic, and it also provides clients with some statistics to show to regulators around the GDPR training that they have in force. And just one other small point on the topic: a learner cannot complete the topic and be marked as having completed the topic unless they pass the assessment. That's the way we recommend that the client set up the training. Obviously, we can change that if clients want.
And finally, and I know everyone will be keen to actually see something working in practice, but before we do that, could you just tell us how you stood over the integrity of the content? I mean, especially as a dynamic subject, where did you go for getting credible sources for designing the content, Paddy?
So, I mean, one of the key resources is actually the GDPR website itself, the EU GDPR website, because it outlines in detail every element of the legislation. It has the legislation up there, but it also calls out the key elements and the key aspects of the legislation itself, how it's different from past legislation, areas that might cause a little bit of controversy, and that allowed us to hone in on the key areas that we needed to focus on. Like I think you've mentioned a couple of them before, like privacy by design, privacy by default, consent, privacy statements, and the like. And it also, I suppose, when we're looking at the legislation like that, one of the key elements of making it relatable to learners is not overcomplicating it. Is taking that legislation, simplifying it, putting it into not so much layman's terms, but terms that are going to relate directly to the learner and how it impacts on their everyday environment. And then once we design our training, we have it reviewed by Cordery Compliance, who are part of the LexisNexis network, who are GDPR experts, and they will give us feedback on any little tweaks or modifications we might need to make to ensure the legislation is very robust when it comes to the GDPR.
Fantastic. I really appreciate that. Neil, I know you've been piloting this presentation for us. Would you mind taking a peek at the new GDPR course and seeing how some of the comments that Paddy's made relate back into the actual training design?
Yeah, super stuff. Thanks, Mark. And just want to double check that that's coming through for everybody there.
It is. We've got your GDPR course rather than your Facebook page.
Okay. I wouldn't want to be giving away my personal data like that. So this is the menu of topics that we have available that Paddy mentioned. Each of them are in and around 5 minutes in length, some a little bit shorter, some a little bit longer. So I'll launch the first topic, and the first thing that we're going to see on screen is that introductory video that really captures the attention of the learners from the outset. So what I'll do is I'll make the audio a little bit louder here, and I'll play it for maybe 15 or 20 seconds or so, and then we can pick things up again afterwards.
People share their personal information with us in many ways, every day. Every time someone fills out a form, signs up to a new online service, signs an employment contract, or downloads an app, they're sharing personal information. And these are just some of the many ways people share their personal information. And we have a legal and moral responsibility to protect all personal information shared with us. From a legal perspective.
So I'll just knock the audio there. So these videos are generally maybe 60 to 90 seconds in length. They really engage the learner from the outset. In terms of some of the other features here that you're seeing on the screen, on the top left, we have our own company logo there in the top left, but that's where we would add any company branding or logos that you would like to include. There's a glossary of terms here on the top right that I can launch that will contain some specific definitions around GDPR. Again, these can be company-specific definitions that can be added, or they can also be tailored if you have other requirements around that. And then we also have a resources section here on the top right for any policy documents or PDF documents, or maybe a link to an intranet site that you may want to include. Once I've been through that, we go into exploring some of the concepts in a little bit more detail. So we're being asked here to identify some of the different types of data here. This is a new screen type that we've added to our suite of templates. So it's a multiple choice screen. We're getting our immediate feedback as to what's correct and what's incorrect. And also on the next screen.
Sorry, Neil, just a step in there on that screen in particular that you looked at, and we're covering the three main players in data protection. And instead of just telling the learner what they are, we're challenging the learner to see if they know who they are, with no real consequences to get it wrong, because we can't give them the correct answer. It's just a way of engaging the learner a little bit more in the training and getting them interacting with the course instead of just reading text off the screen. Sorry for putting in there, Neil.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Paddy. That's super stuff. So on the next screen, we've got a timeline style of screen. Again, we're exploring some of those concepts and doing so through meeting some characters. So we've met the character of Antoine, and we're exploring the idea of consent, also privacy statements, active consent, and then unsolicited emails. And as I mentioned, it's in that timeline screen, which is another screen type that we've added to the suite of templates that we have available. So Paddy did reference our instructional model, where we learn new information and then we have to put that learning into practice and apply that learning in some scenarios. So we get into a scenario here where we're being asked to give Antoine a piece of advice. We have two options here on the right-hand side. We have to choose the appropriate piece of advice. I've chosen correctly here this time, and on the next screen, I'm going to get my feedback again, as Paddy mentioned, as to why that answer is either correct or incorrect. So even if I do make a mistake and I get the question wrong, we're learning from that mistake, and the feedback there is really the teaching point. The other thing that we can do, and I'm going to just open another window here, is show you how some of those scenarios can be customized. So if I just log into our text editing tool here and go to one of our scenario questions, this particular scenario is around anti-bribery, but it does emphasize the point. So we're going to meet Emily here, and I'm going to click the pencil button there on the left-hand side of the screen, and when I do that, it's going to put a little box around all of the text, and if I want to change the character's name, for example, I just highlight the text, hit delete, and then type in whatever text it is that I want to include. So it's very similar to how you would edit maybe a blog or a very simple website. It's very intuitive. It really allows you the opportunity to make the scenarios a little bit more industry specific or company specific, or if you do have some internal policies or practices that you would like to include, it's a very simple way of doing that. And then I hit save, and that will then keep a record of what changes have been made. So if I just launch the tool here again and I pull up the edit log, you'll see that Neil has made the most recent update. You'll see the time that I've made it and what change has actually been made. So it's a really simple, user-friendly tool, and it's really powerful in that it does give you full customization capability. And then if I launch this button here, you'll see a full transcript of all the text that's editable within the scenario. So if I jump back to the course, what I might do is just skip through here to the assessment. So once we've been through those scenarios, we've put some of that learning into practice, we've learned from that feedback, we test for the learner's understanding through simple binary questions, as Patty mentioned. So yes or no, true or false, correct or incorrect style of questions. And you'll see that as we answer questions correctly, we build up our energy bar there at the top of the screen so that we can track our progress. It gives it a bit more of a gamification feel that you're building up a score and tracking your progress that way. And by default, the pass mark is 80%, but that can also be set up specifically if the organization does want to have other pass-fail requirements around that. And we can also customize what happens if you get it wrong. So by default, it will send you back to the beginning. The other final piece then to share is the final topic in each suite is called Taking Action. It's a one-screen summary of the key learning points and the key takeaways from the courseware summarized nicely. And then we have a series of statements that we would ask the learner to attest to before they're deemed to have completed the course. So those statements would be along the lines of, I have read the policy, I'm committed to applying the policy, I understand what my role and responsibilities are, I've taken the training. And again, we would, either using the text editing tool or in partnership with a compliance team or a GDPR privacy team, we would write those statements specific to each organization so that we make sure that they align with your policies and that they're written in language that your learners will be familiar with and that won't overwhelm them or scare them away from attesting. Patty or Mark, anything else to add on that?
No, that's fantastic, and we can make the full course available to anybody that participates in this session, so you'll be able to go through the content. We are making some final tweaks based upon our legal counsel, so we'll provide the latest version of the course, but the scripts will probably be available towards the end of next week when they're all locked down. And this training will be launching in September. I think at the moment we've got it penciled into going in about 20 languages, which is 8 more than our standard offering. In terms of what happens next, just a couple of points that we can discuss off on here. As I said, our first pieces of training are going live in September. Just bring on the next slide if you don't mind, Neil. Yep. So you'll be able to, if you wanted to look at training your organization, we will have materials ready to go available at the end of this quarter. You can try the training for yourself, so we'll provide access to the learning, as I said, and we'll welcome any comments that you have at this stage. And finally, if you want to grab 30 minutes, either with myself, Neil, or Paddy, we can talk about how the program could be customized at your business. And that typically means going a lot further than just adding your branding, but talking about specific roles at your firm and how they're impacted by GDPR. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask, have I had any questions coming from the group today, Neil?
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions, and if there are any final ones, please do feel free to put them through the chat window, and I can pick them up and put them to Mark or Paddy. But the first one is from Melissa, who's asking around GDPR training that's specific to certain roles within the organization. So you did mention content for HR, IT, and Melissa is asking about content specific to sales and marketing staff and also to procurement staff as well.
Paddy, that might be one better for you.
Yeah, I suppose those additional topics are on our list of things to do. So we'll be launching with the core elements that are in the module at the moment in September, and then if we have any specific client requirements, we work very closely with clients to tailor topics that meet their specific needs. So, for example, if you need a topic on procurement and how GDPR impacts that, we can develop that topic in conjunction with you. We can drop it into the training. We can include a profile screen at the start of the training so that your general staff get the core GDPR topics, and then anyone in procurement gets a procurement-specific one, or anyone in sales gets a sales and marketing-specific one. So they're topics that are part of our pipeline at the moment, and we'll be rolling them out quite soon after we launch the core topics in September.
Fantastic. Neil, do you want to take one more question? I know we've run over a little bit, so do you want to pick the one that you feel would be most relevant?
Yep, so the next one is from Mary around customization. So the first part of the question is around flexibility in the color scheme, the fonts, and what level of customization is available there. And more specifically also, we had another question around how often we update the content. So I don't know if we want to maybe tackle both of those in the same answer.
Sure. So in terms of the customization, I hate to use the expression, but the sky really is the limit. So I think it's really more about what we can do in the time frame. So within 3 business days, we can set up branding, links to your GDPR policies, and your GDPR hotline info. Over the course of 10 business days, we can give you access to a text editor that would allow you to go in and make unlimited text edits to the course so that it resonates with your learners. And then finally, if we've got 4 to 6 weeks for the deployment, we can go in and we can change out the artwork, we can build new screens, and we can even build out new topics that are specific to your business. So those really are the options, and it really is just driven by the timeline as to when the training needs to go live. But it's certainly an area that we've looked at, and I think we're ahead of the game in terms of the level of customization we can offer to a ready-made product. Can you just remind us of the second part of the question there, Neil?
Was around updating the content. So how often will we be planning to update it?
Yeah, so our typical cycle for our broader library of 80 topics is annually, but at the moment we are updating every 6 months, just based upon what's happening with the GDPR legislation, how it's evolving, how we're getting in more insight as it gets situated and running live within business on a day-to-day basis. Well, look, I know we've run over by a few minutes. Neil will be sending over a copy of the presentation and access to the course as it stands after this session. We'd love to continue the conversation. If you're interested in talking about deployment, what it might look like, or even just want to pick Paddy's brains, by all means get in touch, and we look forward to getting your feedback on what we've built. Thank you so much, everybody.